Welcome everybody to the discussion about affordable housing, the 2024 budget negotiations, how it's going to impact both the affordable housing on the appropriation side, as well as the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, the AHCIA, on the tax policy side. My name is Ben Nichols. I'm the Director of Operations for the Affordable Housing Team at Bellwether Enterprise. And with me are Liz Osborn, Vice President of Policy at Enterprise Community Partners, and Liz specializes in appropriations and what's going on the Hill. And Ayrianne Parks, Senior Director of Policy at Enterprise Community Partners, specializes in tax policy, runs the Action Committee, and works on the Improvement Act as well as LIHTC, New Market Tax Credits, anything on the tax side. Before we jump in, a couple of housekeeping items. First, please go ahead, if you have a question, submit it through the Q&A box, and we will go through those at the end of the comment or the discussion period. And also, this is being recorded, so there will be a link sent out afterwards if you care to watch it again, or if somebody has missed it and would love to get that wisdom from the three of us. So with that, let's just kind of jump in and we're going to talk first about the budget, the potential of a government shutdown, and then we'll get into the Housing Credit Improvement Act. So first off, why are we here 3 days before the government year ends? And it does look like a shutdown is looming. Now, why are we here? So our last session in June we discussed the debt negotiations, the debt ceiling, and the raising of the debt ceiling. And as folks may remember, we had a top line number that was agreed upon between the president and Speaker McCarthy. That number then allowed the debt ceiling to be raised. There were folks on the House Freedom Caucus that were dissatisfied with that negotiation and felt that Kevin McCarthy should have pushed harder for lower numbers. And they are now saying that number was really a top line number, or a ceiling as opposed to a floor or even just a number. So, and of course, on the Senate side, they're seeing it kind of the opposite direction. And so that's kind of the start of the impasse, is just what does it really mean on this? So with that, I'm going to turn it over and ask Liz. Liz, what's going on today on the Hill?
Thanks, Ben. So happy to be here with you and everyone on the call today. Thanks for including us on the webinar. And I will say it's a bit of a mess, to be honest. So as you mentioned, funding for the federal government expires at midnight on September 30th, which means Congress has just 4 days to 3.5, to come to an agreement on some way to keep the government open in October. Of course, in a perfect world, that would mean having all 12 annual appropriations bills done. But the last time that happened was in 1997. So maybe an unrealistic expectation. Usually we see then instead Congress approve a continuing resolution, which funds the government at current levels for a few weeks or months, or even sometimes a day or two, in order to allow legislators to come to consensus on those final spending bills. But this year is especially wild. It's kind of the result of a few different factors, which you mentioned, right? There's the divided Congress, Republicans in the House, Democrats in the Senate. Republicans have a very narrow majority in the House, which makes it really tough to pass legislation with a majority of the majority. And that means that just a few members can hold stuff up, and then you need Dems to support if you want to get stuff moving. And then the debt negotiations earlier this year saw Speaker McCarthy really lose the faith of his conservative wing, because he struck a deal that lost 71 Republican votes and picked up significant Democratic support. So this all led to a lot of fireworks last week. For a little background, appropriations bills need to originate in the House of Representatives. So generally, that's the body where you see CRs pass first, or continuing resolutions, or CRs. But two separate plans supported by House Republican leadership failed to get enough support to move them just even to the floor for consideration, which is pretty unusual and shows really how dysfunctional things inside that caucus have gotten. So with nothing moving in the House, the Senate started work on their own and basically planned to draft something and attach it to another piece of legislation to get around that fact that spending bills need to start in the House. Basically, the idea is to attach it as an amendment to FAA reauthorization. Everything was going pretty smoothly over on the Senate side with that plan, and they released the text of that CR last night. And then the contents of which is kind of where we started to hit a snag in the Senate. So originally, we were hearing the Senate would release a clean CR. So basically that means like nothing else attached to it, just level funding for the government for a specific amount of time, in this case, 6 weeks. But it now contains $6 billion in aid for Ukraine, along with some other items. And that Ukraine funding makes it hard to pass in the House, and also doesn't include some like border funding that McCarthy wants. But it also is creating a challenge in the Senate where Rand Paul has vowed to slow down proceedings. Normally, when you have a senator that opposes something like this, some must-pass legislation, leadership will come to some agreement with that senator, allowing them to speak on the floor, express their opinion, kind of get their point across, get some good campaign messaging shots, and then move on. But he is specifically actually protesting this, the funding included in the CR, so he will take longer, we anticipate. And if he chooses to really drag out the process to consider the CR, there's a lot of kind of different procedural things that can happen, and it could take quite a while to kind of move through that process. It could go even into Sunday night, which effectively would create a shutdown when the funding expires on Saturday. Now, while the Senate is spinning its wheels a bit, the House is actually showing some small signs of progress, which I say, pretty lightly because they're still not taking up a CR, but they have been able to actually get some things done. They've passed some actual FY24 appropriations bills out of committee, so they're considering them on the floor. It's important to note that that won't actually do anything to avert a shutdown because it's too late to get all FY24 bills done by Saturday. But it does show that kind of the caucus is making progress and working together and starting to move some things through toward the House floor. So what that means is they're still not taking up a CR. The House is basically waiting to see what happens in the Senate. And then at whatever late hour the Senate decides to kind of pass that CR and send it to the House, the speaker is going to have to make some tough choices. He has said he can't bring the Senate version as released last night to the House floor because it doesn't cut spending and it includes Ukraine aid. So I would say there are essentially 3 different things that could happen from here. The first is the House could take the Senate bill and pass on the floor, which won't happen. Just mentioned the speaker's thoughts on that. But mentioning as a theoretical possibility. The second is the Senate could stop the process that they're working on right now and basically start pre-conferencing a CR with the House. And they could come to some sort of agreement together, and then the Senate would then amend their language that they've already released based on those negotiations, vote on that bill, send it over to the House for their consideration. This is a possible scenario, but I think unlikely. It would be hard for the speaker then to claim a win, which we think he really needs to do in order to keep his job. As opposed to saying, look, I took the Senate bill and I changed it and I got the things that I wanted included in it, if those negotiations happen behind closed doors. And frankly, also would require negotiations and compromise in the House that so far the chamber hasn't been capable of doing in the past couple of weeks. And then the third option is that the Senate could pass their CR as is whenever they're able to get to it, send it to the House, and then the House amends it and sends it back. So this, I think, is the most likely scenario, but it's also the most haphazard because there's really no telling if the House then and Senate ever are able to come to an agreement on both of their versions of the CR. And that gets us, I think, into those really kind of dangerous waters of a shutdown that could possibly go on for a little while. If they feel like they're close to a deal, you could see them passing a really short term, like 2 to 3 day CR, if we're kind of looking at that second scenario. But otherwise, I think we're looking at a pretty big stalemate.
Wow. Well, thank you, Liz.
Always the
That
bearer
was,
of good news.
yeah. So, so the next piece is just really talking about if we really do go to a shutdown, what does that mean? And so, unlike the debt ceiling, the government will still have money, right? So the government can still pay, and it will pay on things that it's currently obligated to pay. So contracts that may be going, let's say, from this past June till next May, for instance. Like if you have a Section 8 contract or a direct rental assistance contract, those dollars will continue to be paid. If there is a renewal that needs to happen for a Section 8 contract, for instance, that could happen if there's funding available. But what happens is the government doesn't have authority to create new obligations. And so that's where some of the line is drawn on things like contracts and Section 8. On the FHA side, so for our development partners who may be looking at a 223F or a 221D4 type mortgage, if you have a firm commitment before Saturday, then you could, HUD will continue to close those deals, but deals that are in underwriting will remain in underwriting because the underwriting team is not considered essential for the government purposes. So they will be at home, and when they come back, they'll pick up from where they left off. So that's kind of the way we look at some of these different pieces. They talk a lot about the national parks, of course, is really one of the biggest places that will be closed. You know, the rangers' offices won't be open. We were talking before we started here that in the national park, sometimes the trash will not be picked up because you know, there's nobody on staff to do those types of things. Social Security will continue to be paid because it is actually not part of the budget. It is funded separately. So things that are funded separately or on longer cycles are not impacted by the shutdown. So there's a lot here. There's a lot to figure out. HUD has put out a 120-page guide on what happens when the government shuts down. They did that last month, and so it's a great read. So I highly recommend it. But it does kind of really break out what different programs will happen, and what, you know, has a whole FAQ section. Following up on that, what are you seeing, Liz, on the budget negotiations and or the CR, and how will they impact affordable housing numbers?
Yeah, so thanks. I think just as you mentioned, right, things that are that we have enough funding for will continue. I would also just say add a couple of quick things about HUD funding in particular. And one is that we have been hearing from HUD. I know there's always a lot of questions about rental assistance, right? Because rents increase, and the funding for those contracts was based, you know, the FY23 funding is based on this year. So how do we make sure that we're keeping roofs over people's heads as rents go up? And I will say we've heard from HUD, they believe they'll be well funded on rental assistance through November and maybe even through December. So I think that is an important piece of information. The other thing I'll say is, you know, the last time we had a long shutdown, 35 days, I think people thought about the implications for actually what was happening during the shutdown. And it came as maybe a little bit of a surprise when things didn't just immediately start like flowing out the door as soon as people were back at their desks, right? A lot of agency staff had big backlogs after those 35 days. And so it actually had an impact that was longer than just the shutdown and kind of months into back into being up and running again. So would kind of mention those things. We also have developed with a number of stakeholders a quick reference fact sheet on kind of what happens to many of these programs under a CR or under a shutdown. So I will maybe there's a way for me to put that in the chat, but otherwise we can share out maybe when we share the recording of this. But then the other thing I'll say is that protracted, in terms of FY24 funding, right? Protracted arguments over spending never really, or over, whatever the issue is at hand right now, the CR versus shutdown, never really bode well then for, cooperation in FY24, because people come back to the table and they're feeling frustrated with their colleagues over what has just happened. So that's never a good sign. But I will also say that there was kind of this little provision included in the debt deal that said if Congress doesn't pass all 12 FY24 spending bills by early next year, they will automatically initiate a continuing resolution in April that funds the government at a 1% cut of current FY23 funding levels. And so that's just an interesting, like, another piece of the puzzle to add to it. And also, kind of depending on the way you look at it, could mean higher funding levels for many programs, including affordable housing and community development, than we would see otherwise if you're looking at a deal that writes bills to FY22 numbers or something like that.
Oh, great. And then we've been hearing a lot about this discharge petition. So a discharge petition is when members of the House, you have to have a majority, can take something to committee, a bill to committee, and say, we're going to use this to go around the Speaker's office and bring it to the floor for a vote. The issue with a discharge petition is that it has to sit in committee for 30 days. So after you get a majority, you have to sit for 30 days, and that's not normal days. That is House days. So a day is when they gavel in and out. So, it depends on how long. The good news is that they've already attached it to they have a bill, and they would attach something like a continuing resolution to it that has about 7 days left. And what that would mean is that depending on, of course, we're already within a week, so the government would shut down, but eventually it would go through the House and maybe reopen sometimes in October if they choose this method. The issue there is, would the Republicans or the moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats come all together to make this happen, right? Because that would be undermining Speaker McCarthy in a big way. And so even though there's talk about it, would this actually come to fruition is, it seems like a long shot. I don't know, Liz, if you think any difference, or is this a real feasible solution or just something in the press?
I think the discharge petition is not particularly feasible, but there is definitely something to the concept of, what could happen if Democrats kind of come to the Speaker's defense. Maybe I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about kind of crystal ball reading, but that would definitely be an interesting scenario.
For sure. Sure. All right, well, let's pivot a little bit and talk about tax policy. So, Ayrianne, can you give us a summary of what the latest is for the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act and any update on it in Congress?
Sure, of course. So the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, or AHCIA, as we like to call it, was introduced in May, S 1557 in the Senate and HR 3238 in the House. And it's a bipartisan, bicameral piece of legislation. Really, it's a comprehensive package of provisions that would both expand and strengthen the housing credit. And we have achieved very notable support for the legislation. In particular, the bill would, we kind of break it into two buckets typically when we talk about it. So just as a reminder, there's production provisions that would increase the supply, and those are ones that we typically talk about as things that cost the federal government in terms of like a cost for a legislative proposal. And then there's some things that don't really have a cost that are more about streamlining the program, just making it work a little bit better. Those production provisions include restoring a 12.5% increase that we received in 2018 that expired at the end of 2021. And then a 50% increase for the 9% credit phased in over 2 years with inflation added to that. Then there's also a lowering of the 50% test, which is the amount of private activity bond financing that's needed to unlock those 4% credits for deals requiring private activity bonds. And then there's some basis boosts to better serve the needs of rural and Native communities, extremely low income populations. And then there's also a state discretionary basis boost for 4% housing credit projects. Those basically provide additional equity for difficult to develop areas if it's needed at the state's discretion, if it's needed to make the project financially feasible. And altogether, those would create an additional 2 million rental homes over the next decade. So pretty big increase in affordable housing supply at a time when we really need it. And then there's a bunch of provisions that would just make the program work better, like the casualty loss provision. Right now, it operates on a calendar year. So if you have something happen in January, you've got all year to fix it before the investor could lose their credits. But if it happens in November or December, you have a much shorter period of time to get things back in working order. So it provides up to 25 months and an additional 12 months if it's a presidentially declared disaster, for a maximum of 37 months. So just a few things that just kind of make it work a little bit better. Right now in the House, we have 170 co-sponsors, and that's evenly divided among Democrats and Republicans. And that's because we take what they call a Noah's Ark strategy, which is that they have to come on in pairs. I think we have about 20 Democrats in the House who are waiting in the queue right now. And we expect 2 more to be added as early as today, but probably I haven't seen anything yet. So maybe it'll be tomorrow on congress.gov, bringing us up to 172. We have 79% of the Ways and Means Committee as supporters for the bill. And that's a really big deal because they are the ones who are going to be at the forefront of negotiations since they have jurisdiction over the tax policy. In the Senate side, we just added 2 new sponsors today, bringing us up to 30. We have 63% of the Senate Finance Committee. So I think in just 6 months, having over a third of Congress, we have 200 members of Congress co-sponsoring the legislation as of today, and hopefully 202 soon. So I think that really speaks to both the need for additional affordable housing, but also just, the common sense approach for it. And as Liz was just discussing, and you were just discussing, there's not a lot that Congress is agreeing on right now. So this bill is kind of a unique situation for Congress. So I think that has also helped us in terms of getting additional support when you can go into an office and you can say, look at all these supporters who have signed on to this legislation. It obviously makes sense. So, and then one last thing is that we rolled out a letter last week with local government leaders signing on in support. We had 184 signatures from mayors, county board chairs, and county executives from across the country. That's a letter that we've typically done in past Congresses on the legislation, but we more than doubled last Congress's letter signatures. So in a pretty good position at the moment on that legislation.
Great, great. And how are you seeing that the budget discussions that Liz just went through impacting the AHCIA?
So that's a good question. People always ask, well, so when is Congress going to take up the AHCIA and pass it? And the short answer is that it's not going to. I know. Typically, these tax bills or measures, they pick and choose a few from, different bills and put them into, some sort of smaller tax package. Sometimes it's called tax extenders. And those usually hitch a ride onto other must pass legislation or legislative vehicles.
Right. And do you see that happening this year? So let's say that as we get closer to the end of the year for tax extenders, is that what you guys are hoping for?
Yes, and we are really excited. I think we're in a good place just because of the level of support. But when we rolled that local government leaders letter out, we got some good coverage in Politico's Morning Tax, which is basically kind of, if folks aren't familiar, it's what a lot of tax policy people read in DC, including legislative staffers. And so there was a section in there on the letter, but also on the conversation happening overall with tax negotiations for an end of year package. And I think, obviously everything that happens with FY24 appropriations is going to matter. If we don't get something together, then it's highly unlikely that they're going to have something for a tax extender package to attach to. But if they are able to come to an agreement on it, having robust levels of support like this is going to make it easier for us to get in some of our housing credit priorities. I would say one of the caveats to that is there is also a little bit of partisan rancor when it comes to what sort of things should be in that tax package. So right now, negotiations are kind of going back and forth over the child tax credit, which Democrats want to make sure is in any tax package that moves forward. In fact, Chairman Wyden said that any tax package has to have an extension of the current program. And if folks are familiar with some of the issues that came up with a tax package last year, the Republicans are not necessarily willing to come to the table on the current tax package or on the current child tax credit package. But if there are some members who are interested in maybe seeing some revisions. So it kind of depends on how things work with that. And then Republicans are kind of seen as the opposite, being on the research and development tax credit. But the child tax credit is scored at about $1.2 trillion, and the research and development tax credit is like 158 billion. So there's a bit of a divide there on, what each side thinks is fair. But Ranking Member Crapo brought up the low-income housing tax credit last week as a topic that he thought would be in the year-end mix. So and we've heard from Chairman Smith of the Ways and Means Committee say that housing is something he thinks he can work with Chairman Wyden on in the Senate. So I think we're, in a strong position.
Okay, great. And then one last question. What can the stakeholders who are on the webinar do to advocate either for the AHCIA or for the portions to get into the tax extender bill?
Well, number one, first and foremost, shameless plug for the Action Campaign, which Enterprise co-chairs with the National Council of State Housing Agencies. Membership is free. We keep our members up to date, sharing information on what's going on, and then also help organize outreach efforts to members of Congress to get additional co-sponsorship. Sharing letters like that local government leaders letter, if you take a look at that and you see that you've got mayor or one of your other local leaders on it, being sure to thank them, but also sharing it with your member of Congress to let them know that you want to make sure they support it. And here's, further demonstration of the need for the housing credit. So just kind of, helping us with outreach there and making sure that this stays front and center as those negotiations move forward.
All right. Before we jump into the first question, just a reminder, if you do have a question, please put it into the Q&A box and we will start answering those. And while we wait for more questions to come in, what do you two see in the crystal ball for the next few months?
So I'm happy to jump in there. I think it's from a shutdown CR FY24 approach perspective. I think it will be really interesting to watch over the next few days. There's so many different outcomes and scenarios. I think the most likely is that third scenario that I mentioned above, where the House and Senate are really locked in a stalemate on CR language. I'd give us probably about a 75 chance of at least a short-term shutdown, although there are certainly ways that we avoid that. But then kind of on the other side of that, of a potential shutdown, there's so many different factors that it's hard to see kind of what happens on the other side. And that's because it's really unclear where the middle ground is going to be between the House and Senate, especially on Ukraine. Where obviously this is a very high priority for Democrats. Stripping that language out of the Senate text is an opportunity for Speaker McCarthy to show strength in a place where he's worried about his job. And kind of along those lines, I get a lot of questions of who's going to be Speaker of the House when this is all over. And I'm going to kind of amend what I might have said last week and say, in that third scenario instance, I think McCarthy keeps his job because he didn't need to pull in Dems for a deal in the House. But I will also say we have some close Democrat, sources and relationships that are all kind of divided on what happens if Gates does offer a motion to vacate the chair, so calls for a vote on McCarthy's speakership, which was one of the deals he made to get the job in the first place. You'll recall there were 15 different votes. And one of kind of the concessions was that one single member of the House could call for a vote on the speakership. There's been a lot of talk about Democrats rescuing him in that instance, or not. But if they don't, and he loses the speakership, it'll be interesting to see who gets the chair. But then I'll say, if you really want to kind of come down the rabbit hole with me for a minute, there is certainly a possible scenario where we get a 30-day continuing resolution. The GOP then votes to vacate the chair. So McCarthy is no longer speaker. And then we have no speaker and a government shutdown when the CR ends, and we can't reopen the government because we don't have a speaker of the House.
Yeah.
So that's exciting.
Wow, yeah, that would be interesting. Ayrianne, and what do you think?
I agree with Liz, although I think I'm a little more pessimistic about a government shutdown. I'd probably wager maybe a little bit more like 90-95% shutdown, at least for a couple of days. And I also will caveat that by saying earlier this week, I was like, oh, it seems like things might be coming together. Maybe it'll be a little bit less. And last week I said, absolutely, it was going to shut down. And I think I said it was going to shut down for like 3 weeks. So I feel like it's a day by day situation. If you ask us again in 10 minutes, we might have a different answer.
Yeah. I'll be interested to see what's in my email when we could have new information.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like they can always thread the needle and figure something out where both sides can claim victory. But then every once in a while, to your point, I feel like there is no needle threading that can quite work in this situation. And when you get pessimistic on that side, you don't know how long it could go, right? It's going to take something like the air traffic controllers who basically in 2019, 35 days into working with no pay, said, that's it, we're done working. And, that's the tough part, is with all these essential employees, they go to work without any money, without any paycheck. And they do get reimbursed usually on the back end, or they always have, when the government does have a budget. But without that, I think it's, those types of pressures are what really can drive Congress to do something, for sure. But hopefully we don't get to that point. So, all right, we have a few questions. What is the timeline on the affordable housing finance legislation going to the House floor? And Ayrianne, you kind of said that we don't think it's going to go to the floor.
No, and so typically tax legislation of this type gets negotiated out into a different tax package. Although you will recall, some of you will recall, in June, the House Ways and Means chairman had what he called his birthday package that had a few of his top Republican tax priorities. But there's a bit of a problem in the Republican caucus on whether or not they can actually move that package even forward, because of state and local taxes. A lot of Republicans from blue states are concerned and want to see more SALT deductions included in any tax package.
Gotcha. Kind of on the same, in the same vein, it sounds like the success or failure of the AHCIA depends on the outcome of negotiations for extending the child tax credit and R&D credits in a tax extender. Do you think there's enough time before the end of the year for these negotiations to happen and reach a conclusive result?
I do. Yeah, I mean, they're working on it right now. And there's lots of good conversations. I think that everyone wants to see some sort of tax package move forward, at least from the leadership of the tax committees, if there's a legislative vehicle. So I think they're working really hard amidst all of this other stuff that's happening to try to come up with some solutions and work together on it. Whether that's feasible, I mean, there are some real divides that they need to overcome, will remain to be seen. But yeah, I feel very positive about getting the housing credit in if they do. And I do feel like they're working toward it and that there's enough time. A lot of times these packages come together very quickly, in a matter of days. With tax staffers on the Hill, I do not envy them working around the clock to be able to make that happen.
I would add just to that, that's kind of why the year-long advocacy around AHCIA is so critical, right? If you read in the news that people are talking about a tax deal, you're probably too late, basically, right? Unless you're really part of those negotiations. So, because things move so quickly. So the work of the Action Campaign and everyone on this call who advocates for AHCIA to get strong bipartisan support makes it that much more likely to be included when something moves fast at the end of the year. So thank you.
Nice. If there's no speaker, could Congress still utilize the discharge petition if they start the clock now?
So the discharge petition gets it out of committee, and committee is the thing that's holding that held a lot of those two CRs up originally. I would certainly, that's a possible tool to use. I love the creative. It's a great question. It's definitely the way Congress thinks, right? Like how you're so frequently like, how on earth are they going to get themselves out of this mess? And then they've come up with a new way to do it all the time. I think honestly, a more likely scenario is that they, elect some sort of temporary speaker to get them through whatever those negotiations have, and then happen, and then and then have kind of the more prolonged conversation to replace McCarthy after that.
So, yeah, and then it would, I mean, whenever they do that, the full vote, the kind of what you mentioned earlier, Congress stops, the House stops until they actually have a speaker.
Yes, because the speaker needs to bring the legislation to the floor.
And then one more question, is there a one-pager we can refer to that outlines items that are included in the AHCIA? And I think you were
I
going
know
to.
Ayrianne is on that one.
So I'm going to enter it in, although I think I only have the ability to send it to hosts and panelists.
And we can also include it in the email that we send out to, with the link to the website or to the webinar recording.
Ayrianne, I think if you type your answer into the queue, there you go. Maybe type an answer into one of the other questions and just add it in there.
I'll do. So I'm going to send the entire toolkit there. There's a one-pager on the legislation. And then there's also a detailed bill summary, which I thought some folks might be interested in to kind of see some of those additional provisions. And where you'll also find very soon, there's a series from the bill last year, but we're rolling out a new video series starting next week that goes through every single provision of the bill.
Awesome. I don't see any other questions. Any final comments from either of you? Enjoy the show.
Yeah, sorry, I was just looking at the other Q&A, the Ben shout out. Nice. But no, yeah, I mean, obviously the next couple of days will be really pivotal, and thank you guys for joining us today. And I hope if anyone has additional questions, they feel free to reach out to us.
Great. Ayrianne, Liz, thank you both for your time and for your insight. As I mentioned, we will send out an email for the recording and include action pieces for that as well, including the fact sheet and a link to the website so that we can have all that. But yeah, hopefully everything will work out in the next few days, or if not couple weeks, and any shutdown will be minimal, and that affordable housing funds can continue to flow, and maybe we'd even end up with more credits, which I know we need in a big way. So thank you, everybody, and have a great afternoon.